Hey everyone, so this video is all about working with MIDI. All right, first thing, if we're looking at some MIDI data, so I'm going to zoom in on this drum track and go like this, and we see lots of drum hits, right? So let's just hear it back real quick. Oh, let me solo that and unsolo that. All right, so right now we're in MIDI clips view, which basically means we're treating the MIDI like an audio clip. So I can grab chunks, I can separate clips and move them around if I want to, but I cannot edit the MIDI notes. If I want to edit the MIDI notes here in the edit window, I need to change the view by going to notes like this, and then I will see some more notes there. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. So now I'm able to grab a note and click on it, and you'll hear it audition for a second. And then you can also move and drag things around, do all kinds of stuff like that. Okay, so a couple things you should know about MIDI. So one thing is that all the stuff that matters to Pro Tools in this MIDI data is at the front of this MIDI event. So what that means is if I'm in clips view and I highlight a section of the clip and hit delete like I would audio, if this were audio, this much of that MIDI event would disappear. It would get shorter, right? So that audio would have gotten shorter there. But notice what happened with MIDI. It now just overlaps into empty space. The reason for that is because all the important data, everything that matters to Pro Tools about this MIDI event is right at the beginning. So if I cut off the end in clips view, I don't actually do anything to the MIDI event because all the important stuff was here. This needs to last this long. This is this pitch. This was this volume. All that information is right at the start. Now, if I delete the start of the note, watch what happens. All of it's gone, right? So that's an important thing to note about MIDI. Once in a while you do something and you're like, I know that's going to shorten. Why can't I shorten that note? Why is it still lasting this long? Well, everything that matters and all the information about the duration is at the head of the MIDI event. So if you actually want to shorten the note, you can do that with trim in Notes view. And let's go over to Notes view and have a look at a couple of things while we're there. So in Notes view, you can do all kinds of things to edit. And one of the things that can be a little bit annoying is that you can't always see all the MIDI data that matters. So notice I have one MIDI note really clear right here, but these guys all look like little skinny lines at the bottom. What that means is there's MIDI information that it's out of view below us. So in order to get to that, I can use these tiny arrows on this keyboard piano roll thing. So if I press down, I can click down and scroll down the piano roll until those notes come up. And you'll notice, there we go, and now we have some of those others. And then we can kind of hear them if we want to, right? When we're in Notes view like this, you can kind of think of the pencil tool as your smart tool for MIDI. So there are all kinds of things you can do. So first thing is if you're at the middle of a MIDI note, the pencil turns into a grabber, which means I can take this and move it around. And then it's a trim tool at either end. So we just had that issue where if we want to shorten a note, we can't just cut it off in clips view. We need to actually trim the MIDI note. So you can do that with the pencil tool. If you're at either edge, it will turn into a trimmer. Right? So I can trim the duration from either end by using the pencil tool. Then we can select using the pencil tool by holding down Option or Alt. Notice that turned my pencil into a selector, and then I can just grab a whole bunch of notes if I want to that way. If you're over a note, that won't work. Right? It'll turn into something else. So make sure that you're in space, not over a note, if you want to turn into a selector. You can hold Control to turn it into a crosshair, a marquee grabber. This will let you select specific notes. So I can go and grab just a few. So that's holding down Control or Start. Holding down Command or Control will let you adjust the velocity of the note. And let me show you what that looks like by bringing up. So here's our velocity stocks down below, which we'll talk about in a sec. But here's the volume of that note. Notice it's highlighted here. So that's that note. Now I've got my pencil tool, right? If I hold down Command or Control on a PC, it turns into like a vertical trimmer, and then I can click and drag from the middle of the note, and it will adjust the volume, the velocity of that note. And you'll actually hear it play back so you can get the volume just right using your ear, which is pretty nice too. So pencil tool does all kinds of stuff in here, right? So just to review, we can grab if we're in the middle, we can trim if we're on either edge, then we can turn into a selector if we hold down Option. If we hold down Control, it turns into the marquee grabber. So that's Control or, what was the Controller Start on the Windows machine. Then holding down Command over a note will turn it into a volume velocity trimmer. If you want to draw notes, you can also do this with the pencil tool. So a couple things about drawing notes. You can click and drag if you want to set how long the note is. So if I want a long note, I can click and drag a long note out. Short, I can do short. There's also a default. So if you just click, you'll get one specific length, and you set that with the grid. So a couple ways to do that. So the regular grid, right now it's set at an eighth note, and I'm going to go into grid mode too, so it stays on the grid when I write. And there we go, exactly 1/8 note by just a single click, no drag. Now you can change the grid, and that will change the length, the default length of a note that you click on, right? So now they're quarter notes. And then if you want the grid to be on one thing and the default note value for your pencil to be different, that's here, default note duration. So we can pull this drop down, and right now the default is that it follows the grid, but maybe I don't want it on the grid. Maybe I want to see a grid that's 8 notes, but I want to write by default quarter notes. Cool, so it's now set to quarter notes, so I should be getting a quarter note if I click. And there we go. You can also turn these into dotted notes or triplets after selecting. So you could go quarter note, and then I want a dotted quarter. So you can pull down again and add the dotted, and then you'll get 1.5 quarter notes, right? And there it is. 1.5 quarter notes, 3/8 notes, right there. And again, just click and drag if you want a custom length. And if you're in grid mode, editing mode, you will be locked to the grid when you draw. If that's not on, you can do these things freehand that way. Okay, one other thing to look at real quick while we're in our views. So notes view, velocity view. We're going to do more in notes view in a sec, but just quickly looking at velocity view. So you can, again with the pencil tool, hover over one of these velocity stock heads and change the volume. And you will always hear it play back to you while you're doing that, so that you can hear the actual volume that's happening. So this is a loud note, this is a soft note, and we can click and drag up and down. It'll turn into a grabber to do that with our pencil tool. So if I click and drag but not starting on a velocity stock, I can also freehand draw in, when the pencil's in freehand mode, the volume, right? So you could kind of draw in a fade in a way. So I just clicked and dragged along the free space there, or I can go the other way. So that's click and drag in freehand pencil tool. That gives me a way to draw in the volumes that I want. Okay, going back to notes view. So a couple more things about notes view. So one thing you can do is when we want to select things, so we can do that with the pencil or the grabber, turns into a grabber anyway. I now have a note selected. If I have tab to transients on, I can tab to get from one note to the next. Notice it's popping to the start of each of these notes, right? Each of these drum hits. And as always, if I do Alt or Option, that's the reverse tool. So if I do Option or Alt and then Tab, it will walk backwards. And then Shift and Tab is selecting, right? Shift is always a selector just about. So I can hold down Shift and hit Tab, and that will allow me to select notes. So that's kind of a nice thing. When you have the grabber, you can also, the grabber will default to that marquee tool, so you can always do this to grab chunks of MIDI notes that you want, and you can always hold down Shift and get extras. So maybe I just want these two, and then I want these three over here, but I'm going to leave out the stuff in the middle. And somehow I ended up. I'm going to leave these couple in the middle. Maybe I'll add this one. Right, so you can very quickly click and drag on those with the grabber or the pencil, which was Control or Start. So same thing when you have the pencil, but it's Control. With the grabber, it's automatically the marquee. Okay, so if I get to my snare drum and check out some other, I can get, for instance, from a snare drum to like a side stick hit on that snare. So what if I wanted to just switch all of these snare drums to the same new sound? So what I can do is go over to this MIDI keyboard here and select by clicking all of those guys, all the notes on that spot in the MIDI keyboard. So now I have all of that snare drum, and then I can use the arrows to audition other sounds for all of those hits. So I can go down, that gives me the side stick, and then I can check it out by hitting play. So now all those snare hits are now something else, and then I can click it again and try an arrow down again. Maybe a little rolled thing. Keeps starting in a funny place. That sounds good and terrible. Let's try something else. Back to my regular snare sound. So you can change all of one drum, for instance, by just clicking over here on the piano keyboard, wherever that note is, and it will let you adjust all of the hits on that spot to a different MIDI position, and you get a slightly different sound, which is super cool, because you can just switch out a kick drum or a snare hit for a side stick like we heard really easily. So let's keep looking at the notes view for a sec, and I'm going to actually go to this guy now, something melodic. So I've got this like simple, you know, bell kind of thing happening. So a couple other things you can do in this notes view is, and by the way, I'm zooming in with this the vertical zoom over here. So that's the MIDI zoom in to get these a little bit bigger so they look a little prettier and easier to deal with. So what I'm going to do, so I can select a couple notes, and if I want to jump those notes up an octave, so an arrow will go up, will transpose up a semitone, right? A half step, right? So there's a couple of cool things we can also do. So if I hold down Shift and press an arrow, it will jump an octave. And then I can also do a cool thing where I hit Option and press an arrow key. You'll get a copy of those notes. Then you can let go and move those copies around with the arrows too. So then maybe I get a little, I can make a little harmony part or something. So not quite. So I don't like it, but I can totally make a harmony part by option dragging or selecting. So selecting a couple of MIDI notes and then option dragging, or option, holding down option and pressing an arrow will give me a copy of those notes. So quick, easy way to make a little harmony part if it makes sense, which it totally doesn't right there. Okay, so one quick, really annoying thing that can happen when you're trying to loop MIDI. So remember, all the information that really matters to Pro Tools when it's looking at a MIDI event is at the start, right? So I'm gonna switch to notes view real quick and show you a problem that happens all the time. Here's a MIDI note, and I'm gonna put that start just ahead of the beat. So just before the beat, even like the tiniest bit before the beat, like there maybe, and then watch what happens. So I'm gonna switch back to grid, and I'm gonna switch back to clips view, and I want a loop of this thing. So I'll make a clip out of that chunk right there. So now I've got my clip separated, and if you, that's Command E, by the way. So here's my loop, right? It should loop. If I hit Command D, I should get the same thing again. Do you see what happened? can you tell? That first note right here, when I duplicate this guy, I lose that note. It's gone. And this happens all the time when you're trying to loop MIDI in Pro Tools. Is you have your first loop, and then if that first MIDI hit was off at all, it's gone. So the trick is, before you loop MIDI, make sure that you're not cutting off even the tiniest little bit at the start of that MIDI note. And the easiest way to do it is just get in grid mode and then go to Notes View, use the grabber or the pencil tool and at the middle of the clip, and then just drag it till it snaps to that grid line. And then you're guaranteed to have a good looping chunk here. So now if I duplicate this, and here, let me just delete this so you don't have to have the distraction. Duplicate, and there we go. It loops just fine now. We didn't lose that start note. You can see it here and then there. So really annoying thing you kind of have to watch out for. But other than that, working with MIDI is pretty easy. Okay, so just a couple of setup things, and then I think we're good to go. So let's head over to the mix window and have a look at just a couple of things in regard to the mix window. So first thing is, if you're really dealing with MIDI input and output, one important thing that you need to know is that most of the time you don't see the instrument view. And in order to see that, we go to View and then Mix Window Views and click Instruments. And that will give us our instrument input and output. The input selector, which is defaulting to all, which it probably should be, that is about what MIDI input is going to be received by this track. So what MIDI controller will write to this track. So if I record enable it, this will then take input from any MIDI capable controller you have plugged in. So say you have 3 different MIDI controllers, they all would be able to write to this track right now. So that's the all setting, but you could always pick a specific one if you needed to. Second thing, the output of this instrument track is going to a specific instrument. And by default, it's going to go to the instrument that's on the insert. So if that's ever missing or the wrong instrument, then the output of this track will go to a different instrument and may cause unexpected results. So the output is which MIDI instrument is going to play the MIDI data that's sitting on this track. So just always a good idea to check and make sure that all is selected by default usually, but if it's something else, sometimes that will be the reason your MIDI controller is not getting a response from Pro Tools. And then the other one is it's not playing back right. Well, why is that? Well, maybe the output is not going to the right MIDI instrument. Most of the other things are pretty standard. The pan controls are the same as always. Record enable, solo, mute, all that stuff works about the same. The fader is about the overall volume coming off the track. So all this stuff is pretty standard. Then we should make sure that in options, MIDI through is checked. That is about taking the MIDI controller that's plugged in and sending it to whatever record enabled track you have. So if you don't have MIDI through on, so I'm going to turn on my MIDI controller and then hit that a couple of times. And now I'm going to go over and turn off MIDI through and nothing. Right? So if MIDI through somehow got turned off, that's another reason why Pro Tools is not receiving information from your MIDI controller. So that's an important one, MIDI through. So I'm going to go over to the clip list here. Okay, so we might have some audio in the clip list, some MIDI in the clip list that we want to audition. So here's some clips of MIDI information, right? And I might want to check these out. Well, Pro Tools doesn't know which MIDI instrument should play back these clips. You have to tell it. In order to tell it, you go to Setup, Preferences, and then you'll get that dialog box and you can go over to the MIDI tab. Then what you want to check on is Default Through Instrument right there. So right now it's set to none, which is usually a good thing, but it doesn't help me if I need to preview some MIDI data in the clip list. So the default through, you can pick a specific instrument to do it, but that's not going to be as versatile. What you really probably want to select is Follows First Selected MIDI Track, which means that whatever MIDI track I select over here is going to become the MIDI instrument that will play back this audio. So I can hit OK here, and then say that I want to hear this Falcon thing. Here's one of those clips, but I want to hear it with Superior Drummer. So I can click Superior Drummer, and then remember to audition audio over here in the clip list. We hold down Option, and it'll turn into a little speakery icon guy, and then I can click. Would love to. There we go. There's some audio. So it's not working very well, right? That's because I'm having some MIDI data that may not correspond well to Superior Drummer's drum sample MIDI locations, right? And we can always go the other way around. So we can have the drummer play this, or I can have Falcon play this Superior Drummer thing. So I click on Falcon, go over to one of these Superior Drummer loops, which is kind of fun. So now Falcon is playing back whatever MIDI data it finds in this MIDI clip, which is kind of fun, right? So you can audition MIDI data with whatever instrument you've selected over here. The other thing that that setting does is allows you to play back without record enabling. So notice I just pressed some MIDI keys and heard some drums. If I click on Falcon, I'll be able to play some notes. Right? So just clicking, just highlighting the track automatically enables this to play back from the MIDI controller without record enabling. The problem with that is that if you do that, you may end up with all of your virtual instruments living in the low latency domain. And what that means is if you have a lower buffer setting and you're trying to record, you might start getting errors because of that, because they're taking up too much system resources. So after auditioning in this fashion, and if you are having system resource issues, this might be the place to check, because it might be that all of your virtual instruments are being loaded into the low latency domain, into the memory that you need for playback and record and stuff. So again, that's Setup, Preferences, MIDI, and when you're done auditioning stuff in the clip list in whatever instrument you're going to use, then you probably want to turn default through instrument back to none. And it's really not a big deal to have to record enable Falcon in order to see what it sounds like, right? Right? But nothing happens in the clip list unless I have that preference and I've defined what the default through instrument is, or set it to follows first selected track, so that I can select a MIDI track and it will choose that instrument to play back my audition. Cool. So that is it for MIDI for the day. I will see you in the next one.